What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the world was something the world had already decided was worthless? For 19-year-old Alice Pemberton, left homeless and with only a $10 bill to her name, that question wasn't a matter of philosophy. It was the sharp edge of survival. She spent that last $10 on a derelict, abandoned naval yard on the Columbia River, a place the county records had marked as a liability, a boneyard of rust and ruin. But what she found waiting for her inside a sealed dry dock, a secret that had been gathering dust for decades, would not only change her life, but shock the very foundations of a nation that had long forgotten its own secrets. Settle in and stay close as we tell the story of a forgotten place and the determined young woman who listened to its silence. Let us know where you're watching from tonight as we journey back to the wild banks of the Columbia. Alice Pemberton arrived in Ridgewater, Oregon, the way a stray leaf arrives in a forgotten corner of a porch, carried by a wind she didn't control, and settling where the motion finally stopped. She stepped down from the dusty passenger car with a single worn leather satchel and the weight of a loss so total it had no edges. Her father was gone, buried under a simple wooden cross on a hill overlooking the farm that was no longer theirs. The bank had taken it all: the fields, the house, the barn her great-grandfather had raised. All that remained of her old life was the too large wool coat on her back, her father's last possession, and an old, gray-muzzled mule named Jedediah tied to a post near the station, his weary eyes blinking in the unfamiliar light. At 19, she possessed the quiet, weathered stillness of someone much older, someone who had learned that protest was a luxury and silence was a shield. She had come to Ridgewater for the simple reason that the train ticket here had cost $2 less than a ticket anywhere else. It was the end of the line. For the first week, she existed in the margins of the town. She made a deal with the liveryman, a stooped fellow named Gus, to muck out the stalls in exchange for a bed of hay in the loft, a place that smelled of horses and dry clover, a scent so close to home it was a fresh kind of pain each night. Jedediah earned his keep as well, hauling feed sacks from the general store. Alice spoke little, and the townspeople spoke of her in whispers. They saw a girl hollowed out by grief, another piece of driftwood washed up on their shore. They were not unkind, but they kept their distance, as people do from the unfortunate, as if poverty were a contagion. She ate her meals, usually a heel of bread and some cheese, sitting on a riverside stump, watching the immense, silent power of the Columbia River slide toward the sea. The river didn't care who she was or what she'd lost. Its indifference was a strange sort of comfort. It was during one of her walks through the small, dusty town that she saw the notice tacked to the board outside the county clerk's office. It was a list of properties to be auctioned for back taxes. Most were small, forgotten lots, but one entry at the very bottom of the page caught her eye, written in a dismissive scrawl. Lot 17. Federal Naval Yard, 12 acres, riverfront. Condemned structures, sold as is. Minimum bid, $10. A seed of a thought, desperate and wild, began to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. The county auction was held in the back room of the saloon, a space that smelled of stale beer and desperation. The room was sparsely populated with a few local ranchers looking to expand their grazing lands, and the ever-present figure of Silas Croft, a man who had bought up half the county with a combination of shrewdness and intimidation. He sat near the front, his bulk overflowing his chair, a fat cigar clenched in his teeth. The auctioneer, a tired man named Mr. Davies, rattled through the first few lots with a practiced monotony. When he got to Lot 17, he sighed, as if burdened by the very mention of it. "All right, folks. Last one. The old Federal Naval Yard. 12 acres on the water. Structures are condemned, unstable. Property's got a sealed dry dock building. County takes no responsibility. We're selling the deed, not the liability. He looked out over the small crowd. We'll open the bidding at $10. A low chuckle rippled through the room. Silas Croft let out a loud, contemptuous snort. You'd have to pay a man $100 to haul that junk away, Davies, he boomed, to the amusement of the other men. The auctioneer's face didn't change. He waited, the silence stretched. Alice, standing in the back of the room, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. It was all the money she had left in the world, folded into a small, tight square in her pocket. It was foolish. It was insane. It was the only thing she could do. Her voice, when it came out, was barely a whisper, thin and reedy in the heavy silence. $10? Every head in the room turned to look at her. Silas Croft swiveled in his chair, a look of pure disbelief on his face, which quickly curdled into a mocking grin. Well, I'll be, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The little orphan wants to buy a boneyard. The men laughed with him. Alice's face burned, but she held her ground, her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. She did not look at Croft. She would not give him the satisfaction. Mr. Davies looked at her, then around the room. I have a bid of $10 for lot 17. Do I hear 15? He was met with more snickering. He didn't wait long. Going once, going twice. He looked at Croft, who just shook his head, still smiling. Sold, Mr. Davies said, his gavel cracking against the wooden podium with a sound of finality. To the young lady in the back for $10. She walked to the front, conscious of every eye on her, and carefully unfolded her last $10 bill, placing it on the table. It was worn and soft from years of use. Mr. Davies pushed a brittle yellow deed toward her. Her name, Alice Pemberton, was written in fresh ink. It felt both impossibly heavy and utterly meaningless. Outside, Jedediah waited patiently, his breath misting in the cool morning air, a silent witness to the moment she had traded all she had for all she had left. A piece of paper for a patch of rust. What could a 19-year-old girl, alone in the world, possibly do with a derelict naval yard? What forgotten secret was rusting away inside that sealed dock, dismissed by everyone as worthless junk? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find inside that mysterious building. Now, settle back in, because her journey was only just beginning, and the yard had been waiting a very long time. The news of Alice's purchase traveled through Ridgewater with the speed of gossip in a town with little else to talk about. She became a local curiosity, a cautionary tale whispered over fence posts and store counters. The Pemberton girl, they'd murmur as she walked by, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground before her. Bought the boneyard. The children would sometimes follow her for a little ways, daring each other to get closer, as if her foolishness might be catching. She ignored them all, her silence a wall they could not penetrate. The mockery became more direct when Silas Croft cornered her outside the general store. He blocked her path, his shadow falling over her like a physical weight. He smelled of expensive cigars and cheap superiority. I heard what you did, he said, his voice a low rumble of condescension. That was a fool's purchase, girl. That place is a death trap. The ground is soured, and the buildings are ready to fall if you so much as sneeze on them. He pulled a silver dollar from his waistcoat. I'll give you $1 for the deed. Save you the trouble of getting yourself killed out there. Alice looked at the coin, then up at his fleshy face. She didn't speak. She simply shook her head once, a small, resolute movement. Croft's face tightened, his condescension turning to anger. "Stubborn fool," he spat, pocketing the coin. "Don't come crying to me when you break your neck on that pile of scrap." He stormed away, leaving her standing in the swirling dust. Later that day, as she was buying a length of rope and a few nails, practical things for a life that was about to become profoundly impractical, a strange encounter broke through her isolation. An old woman named Ilara, who lived in a small cabin at the edge of town and was regarded by most as half-mad, approached her. Ilara's face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and her eyes were a pale, piercing blue. She didn't offer greetings or pleasantries. She simply looked down at Alice's hands, which were already calloused and strong from a life of farm work. "Good hands," the old woman said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. Then she looked directly into Alice's eyes. "Some vessels are built to carry more than cargo," she said, each word delivered with a strange, formal weight. "They carry a promise." Without another word, Ilara turned and shuffled away, leaving Alice standing by the nail barrel, the cryptic words hanging in the air. A promise? The only promise Alice felt was the promise of a cold winter and a hard life. And yet, the words stuck in her mind, a splinter of mystery she couldn't quite dislodge. The town's collective judgment was a heavy cloak. She felt their pity and their scorn, and it solidified her resolve. This yard, this worthless, dangerous, forgotten place, was hers. It was the only thing in the entire world that belonged to her. In her satchel was a letter from Thomas, the young blacksmith she'd grown up with, the closest thing she had to a friend. He had enclosed $2 and begged her to use it for a ticket home. But there was no home to go back to. There was only forward, into the unknown. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the land, she loaded her few belongings onto Jedediah's sturdy back. She tied the new rope to his halter, and with a last look at the town that had already written her off, she started the long walk toward her new property, a place she had never seen, a place everyone had warned her was a grave. The walk to the Naval Yard took her out of Ridgewater and along the winding, muddy bank of the Columbia. The path, once a service road, was now little more than a deer trail, choked with alder and thistle. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the vast metallic tang of the river itself. The sun bled out behind the western hills, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. By the time she saw the silhouette of the yard against the fading light, dusk was settling into a deep, starless twilight. It was a skeleton. That was her first thought. The skeletons of cranes reached for the sky like rusted iron claws. The skeletons of workshops and sheds leaned against one another for support, their roofs gaping open to the heavens, and dominating it all, squat and immense, was the dry dock. It was a monstrous building, a great wooden leviathan sheathed in corrugated iron, its massive main doors chained and padlocked, sealed against the world. The sheer scale of the decay was overwhelming. It was worse than she had imagined. It was worse than Silas Croft had described. A wave of cold, hard despair washed over her, the first real crack in the stoic armor she had worn since her father's death. What had she done? She had traded her last dollars, her last hope, for a tomb. She leaned her forehead against Jedediah's warm, solid flank, burying her face in his coarse, gray mane, and for a moment she allowed her shoulders to shake with a single, silent sob. The old mule didn't move. He simply stood, a steady, breathing anchor in her sea of regret, and nudged her gently with his soft nose. There was no getting into any of the buildings that night. The doors were either rusted shut or boarded over. She found a relatively sheltered spot in the lee of the great dry dock building and set about making a camp. She gathered driftwood from the riverbank and, using the flint and steel her father had taught her to use, coaxed a small, sputtering fire to life. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, but seemed to make the surrounding shadows deeper and more active. She ate the last of her bread, watching the black water of the river slide silently by. The silence here was different from the silence of the farm. It was a heavy, industrial silence, haunted by the ghosts of forgotten labor, punctuated by the groan of rusting metal in the rising wind and the distant cry of a nightbird. She wrapped herself in her one thin blanket, the cold ground already seeping through, and fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she was startled awake. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. It was a sound, or rather a feeling, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate up from the very ground beneath her. It came from inside the massive dry dock. It lasted only for a few seconds, a deep thrum that was more felt than heard, and then it was gone, leaving only the whisper of the wind. She told herself it was just the river's current, or the old building settling. But the feeling of it, a strange and impossible pulse in the heart of the ruin, lingered in the cold night air. In the pale, misty light of dawn, the yard looked even more desolate. Alice began a systematic exploration, her practical farm girl nature taking over. The workshops were filled with debris, their floors littered with tools that had been left where they were dropped decades ago, now fused by rust into abstract sculptures of decay. Weeds grew thick and green through the rotting floorboards. Everything of value had been stripped long ago, leaving only the heavy, immovable, and worthless. She spent most of the morning circling the dry dock, the source of the strange nocturnal vibration. It was an enormous structure, built of massive old-growth fir beams and clad in rusting iron sheets. The main doors were secured with a padlock the size of her fist, its surface a solid cake of orange rust. There were no windows, no other visible entrances. It was a fortress, a tomb designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. As she ran her hand along the weathered wooden planks near the foundation, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. A section of wood, about 2 feet square, felt different. It was smoother than the surrounding timber, the grain running in a different direction. It was a patch, an incredibly skillful one, set so perfectly flush that it was almost invisible. It was low to the ground, half hidden by a thick growth of thistle and burdock. Her brow furrowed. Why would anyone go to the trouble of so expertly patching a building that had been condemned and abandoned? It was then that Jedediah, who had been placidly tearing at a patch of tough grass nearby, ambled over. He lowered his great gentle head and sniffed intently at that exact spot on the wall. He blew a soft puff of air from his nostrils, then nudged the patch with his nose. He let out a low, soft nicker, a sound he usually reserved for when he found a sweet apple. He nudged the wood again, more insistently this time, looking back at Alice with his intelligent dark eyes as if to say, "Here, look here." Trusting the old mule's instincts, Alice knelt in the damp grass, pushing aside the thistles. She examined the edges of the patch more closely. The seam was almost perfect. She pressed her ear against the wood, the rough grain scratching her cheek. The world went quiet, muted by the thick timber. She heard only the sound of her own breathing and the distant rush of the river. She waited. For a long, silent minute, there was nothing. Then she felt it again, and this time she heard it. Faint, impossibly faint, but undeniable. Not a hum, but a slow, rhythmic, and deliberate beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was like listening to a giant, sleeping heart through a dozen layers of wool. It was impossible. It had to be an echo, a trick of the wind, the percussive beat of a river eddy against the foundation. But it felt too regular, too organic. She pulled back, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. She didn't try to open it, not yet. The discovery was too strange, too unsettling. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of practical activity, clearing a space in one of the smaller, partially collapsed sheds to create a more permanent shelter. But her mind was not on her work. Her eyes kept returning to the silent, monolithic wall of the dry dock and the impossible, secret heartbeat it held within. The days that followed fell into a simple, grueling rhythm. Wake at dawn. Fetch water from a rusty but still functional well pump she'd managed to free up. Work until dusk. Sleep. The labor was a kind of solace. She wasn't trying to reclaim the whole yard. That was an impossible task. She was simply carving out a small space of order in the chaos, a place to exist. She patched the roof of her chosen shed with scavenged sheets of iron, cleared the floor of debris, and built a small stone fire pit outside. Her hands, already calloused from farm life, grew tougher, the skin thickening over her palms. The physical exhaustion at the end of each day was a welcome anesthetic, blunting the sharp edges of her grief. When she thought of her father, it was less with a sense of raw loss and more with a quiet appreciation for the skills he had taught her. How to swing an axe, how to mend a fence, how to be patient. Jedediah was her constant, silent companion. He would stand nearby as she worked, his presence a quiet affirmation. But the mystery of the dry dock was a constant pull. Every day she would spend an hour or two working at the strange wooden patch. She'd found a heavy, rusted pry bar in one of the sheds, and she used it to carefully, painstakingly work at the almost invisible seams. The wood was stubborn, hard as stone, but Alice was more stubborn still. As she worked, other small, incongruous details revealed themselves. She noticed a series of faint scratches on the iron doorframe of the main entrance, high up, not the kind of wear caused by weather, but the deliberate marks of a tool trying to force the lock. On the massive padlock itself, she scraped away a layer of rust and found a series of numbers and letters stamped into the steel, almost worn away by time. 18-USN-01. The physical act of prying at the patch taught her about the building's construction. This was no ordinary shed. The beams were hand-hewn, fitted together with a precision that spoke of military engineering. This structure wasn't just built, it was crafted. It was designed to protect something of immense value. One afternoon, the smell of the old fir wood, released by her prying, triggered a vivid memory. She was a little girl in her father's workshop. He was showing her how to make a dovetail joint, the wood pieces sliding together to form a bond stronger than nails. "You have to respect the material, Alice," he had said, his large, gentle hands guiding hers. "It'll tell you its secrets if you listen with your hands." The memory renewed her determination. She wasn't just fighting against wood and nails. She was in a conversation with the past. Finally, after a week of patient, persistent labor, she felt a subtle give. The pry bar sank a half-inch deeper. With a final, determined heave, The patch groaned and shifted inward. It wasn't just a patch. It was a small, cleverly concealed door, fitted so perfectly into the wall that its existence was a secret. Inside was a square of profound darkness, and a gust of stale, trapped air that smelled of dust, cold metal, and something else she couldn't place. A sharp, clean scent like the air after a lightning strike. She had no lantern, only a few precious matches and a candle stub. She couldn't go in yet. She stood on the threshold, her heart pounding in her chest, the cool, strange-smelling air breathing out from the dark. The slow, rhythmic thumping from within seemed a little louder now, a steady, patient pulse calling to her from the blackness. The next morning, she returned, her resolve hardened by a night of restless anticipation. She carried a single candle stub shielded from the breeze inside a tin can with holes punched in its sides. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she squeezed her slender frame through the narrow opening. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press in on her. The air was cold, still, and heavy with the weight of years. She fumbled with her flint and steel, her knuckles scraping against the rough wood. A spark caught, and she lit the candle's wick. A small, brave flame flickered to life, pushing back the immense gloom. She was in a cavern, a vast, cathedral-like space that dwarfed her small light, and in the center of it, resting in a massive wooden cradle, was a ship. At least it was the hull of a ship. It was long and sleek and utterly alien. It was not made of wood. The flickering candlelight glinted off a surface of smooth, dark metal, a matte gray steel that seemed to drink the light. It had no masts, no rigging, no place for sails or a smokestack. Its shape was low and predatory, like some great river pike, utterly unlike any riverboat, coastal trader, or naval vessel she had ever seen or imagined. This couldn't be right. A steel ship of this design, here, in this forgotten yard on the banks of the Columbia. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was unfinished. Sections of the deck were open, revealing a complex ribcage of steel beams. But the hull itself, the vessel's essential form, was complete. It filled the dry dock, a silent, sleeping giant. The slow, rhythmic thumping was much clearer in here, the sound echoing softly in the vast space. It was undeniably coming from the vessel itself. Timidly, she approached it, her homemade lantern casting long, dancing shadows across the cold steel plates. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the hull. It was not cold, as she expected metal to be. It was faintly, almost imperceptibly, warm, and through the palm of her hand, she could feel the vibration, the steady, living pulse, thump, thump, thump. Awe and a creeping sense of dread warred within her. She began to walk the length of the hull, her small light a fragile beacon in the immense darkness. Near the stern, she found a small, circular access panel, no bigger than a dinner plate, that had been left slightly ajar. Peering inside, her candlelight revealed a bewildering tangle of thick copper wiring, brass fittings, and strange, delicate glass bulbs filled with intricate filaments. It was machinery far beyond her comprehension, more like the workings of a giant clock than a ship. Tucked into a leather pouch hanging from a hook just inside the opening was a thick, sealed oilskin packet. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, trembled as she worked it free. Carefully, she broke the brittle wax seal on the packet. Inside was a tightly rolled sheaf of blueprints and a letter, its own seal, bearing the emblem of the United States Department of the Navy still intact. She carried her discovery over to a clear patch of dusty floor and carefully unrolled the blueprints. The document was covered in precise, elegant script and complex diagrams. At the top, in bold letters, was the title, Project Archimedes, Submersible Vessel Number 1. The letter was a formal commission, dated nearly 2 decades prior, ordering the secret construction of a prototype underwater boat for coastal defense. The rhythmic sound, the document explained, was a revolutionary long-duration galvanic pile, an experimental battery designed to power the vessel's electric motor, a galvanic heart that was, impossibly, still holding a faint charge after all these years. This wasn't just an abandoned naval yard. It was a secret government laboratory. This vessel wasn't just a ship. It was a dream of the future, abandoned and forgotten by the world. She looked from the blueprints to the impossible silent ghost in the dark. Ilara's strange words echoed in her mind. Some vessels are built to carry more than cargo. They carry a promise. This was the promise. And she, Alice Pemberton, a homeless girl with nothing to her name, was now its keeper. Just then, a low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, and the wind began to howl, rattling the old iron roof of the dry dock. A storm was coming. The storm broke over the Columbia River with a sudden, violent fury. The sky turned a bruised, angry gray, and the wind tore at the derelict buildings of the yard, peeling away sheets of rusted iron with a sound like a scream. Rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the ground to mud in minutes. The river itself, usually a calm, majestic presence, transformed into a churning, frothing monster, its surface rising with terrifying speed. Alice stood just inside the hidden opening of the dry dock, watching the deluge, and realized with a sickening lurch of her stomach that the entire yard was on low-lying ground. A flood was not just possible, it was inevitable. Her first instinct was pure survival. Flee. Get herself and Jedediah to higher ground before the river cut them off. But then she looked back into the darkness of the dry dock, at the immense, silent shape of the submersible. She looked at the blueprints in her hand, the commission letter that spoke of patriotism and innovation. This wasn't just a collection of metal plates and strange machinery anymore. It was a legacy. It was a piece of history, a forgotten dream that had been entrusted to her. To abandon it now would feel like the worst kind of betrayal, like abandoning her father's memory all over again. In that moment, she made her choice. She would stay. She would protect it. As she frantically began dragging scrap lumber and old tarps to reinforce the small hidden door against the rising water, a desperate cry for help, nearly swallowed by the gale, reached her ears. Peering out into the maelstrom, she saw it. A small farm wagon, its back wheel shattered, stranded just outside the yard's crumbling fence. A man, a woman, and a small, bundled shape were huddled against the useless wagon as the water swirled around their ankles. Without a second thought for her own safety, Alice ran out into the storm. The man, his face a mask of desperation, explained their wagon had hit a washed-out patch of road. Their child was sick with a fever, and they had been trying to reach the doctor in the next town. Alice didn't hesitate. "Come with me," she shouted over the wind. "There's shelter." She helped the man unhitch their terrified horse and led the small, bedraggled family toward the dry dock. She guided them through the hidden opening into the vast, dark space. The man, whose name was Samuel, and his wife, Mary, stared in stunned silence at the colossal metal shape that loomed out of the darkness, lit only by Alice's single, flickering candle. "In God's name," Samuel whispered. "What is that?" Alice looked at the great vessel, her vessel. "A promise," she replied, her voice steady and sure. The water began to seep under the main doors, pooling on the floor. For the next several hours, the three of them worked in a desperate, frantic ballet, using anything they could find to plug the leaks and brace the doors. Mary cradled her son, who was shivering violently despite the sweltering humidity. Through it all, the steady thump, thump, thump of the vessel's galvanic heart provided a strange, rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos of the storm, a calm and persistent beat in the heart of the tempest. The floodwaters rose, pressing against the old building. The main doors began to groan and splinter under the immense pressure of the river. Alice, soaked and exhausted, felt a new kind of strength surge through her. She was no longer just a grieving orphan. She was a guardian. The great doors held. Through the night, they groaned and shuddered, but the old-growth timber and iron fittings, forged for a purpose long ago, did not fail. By morning, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sun filtered through the clouds, revealing a world transformed. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind a thick blanket of mud and debris that covered everything. The naval yard was a ruin of a ruin, but inside the dry dock, its precious secret was safe. Miraculously, the child's fever had broken during the night. He slept peacefully in his mother's arms. Samuel, the man Alice had rescued, looked at her with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. He introduced himself properly. He was a doctor, on his way to take up a new post in the port town of Astoria. He looked at the submersible, his initial shock replaced by a deep, intellectual curiosity. He walked its length, running a hand over the smooth steel plates. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, his voice echoing in the quiet space. "The principles of its design, the engineering, it's decades ahead of anything I've ever read about." He looked at the blueprints, his eyes wide with understanding. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice full of respect, "you have stumbled upon something of immense national importance." He promised that as soon as he reached a town with a telegraph, he would send a message to a former professor of his, now a high-ranking official at the Department of the Navy in Washington City. A week later, after Dr. Samuel and his family had safely departed, a vehicle unlike any ever seen in Ridgewater rolled into town. It was not a dusty farm wagon, but a polished black government carriage, drawn by two perfectly matched horses. Two men in dark, well-fitting suits stepped out, their city shoes looking alien on the dusty street. They asked for the location of the old naval yard and the whereabouts of a Miss Alice Pemberton. Alice, alerted by a breathless boy from town, met them at the gate. One was a stern-looking naval officer, the other a younger man with the keen, intelligent eyes of an engineer. They carried a copy of Dr. Samuel's telegram. Alice said nothing, simply leading them to the dry dock and through the hidden door. The two men stopped dead, their mouths agape. They stood in silence for a long time, their own powerful lanterns playing over the sleek, powerful lines of the submersible. The engineer unfurled his own set of documents, comparing them to the vessel, muttering to himself about galvanic engines and variable ballast tanks. The officer, Commander Davies, read the commission letter Alice gave him, his expression one of profound awe. "Project Archimedes," he said, his voice hushed. "We thought it was a myth, a legend from the old department. The primary records were lost in a fire years ago." Silas Croft, having heard of the important visitors, had ridden out to the yard, a smug look on his face, clearly expecting to witness Alice's eviction. He arrived just in time to see her standing not as a trespasser, but as a proprietor, deep in conversation with the naval officers. He overheard Commander Davies discussing the government's intention to buy back the land and the vessel for a sum that made Croft's greedy eyes widen in disbelief. He heard the officer offer Alice a formal, salaried position as the project's civilian caretaker, citing her uncommon courage and stewardship. Croft looked from the impossible ship to the quiet, dignified young woman who now held the attention of powerful men. He, who had mocked her, who had called her a fool, was nothing more than a spectator to her triumph. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode slowly back to town, a man profoundly and silently humbled. The whispers in Ridgewater changed that day. They were no longer whispers of pity or scorn, but of wonder. The Pemberton girl, the fool who bought a boneyard, was a fool no longer. A month passed. The naval yard was no longer a place of decay and silence. It was alive with the quiet, purposeful hum of activity. A team of naval engineers and shipwrights, sent from the east, worked carefully to stabilize the derelict buildings and prepare the submersible for its long journey. They had christened it the Promise, in honor of the word Alice had used to describe it to the rescued doctor. Alice herself stood on the riverbank at sunset, the golden hour light glinting off the water and painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold. Jedediah stood beside her, his favorite position, with his heavy, gentle head resting on her shoulder. The town of Ridgewater, in a collective act of apology and admiration, had offered her the deed to a small, clean house on a quiet street. She had politely declined. She preferred her small, repaired shed here at the yard, near the river and the vessel that had changed her life. She belonged to this place now. Commander Davies, a kind, formal man who had become a respectful friend, walked up to stand beside her. "You've become quite the local hero, Miss Pemberton," he said gently. "The papers back east are already writing about the Columbia River discovery. They say you saved a vital piece of America's future." Alice watched the engineers securing a new harness around the great steel hull. She looked down at her own hands, the calluses thick and smooth, the hands of a worker, a farmer, a caretaker. She thought of her father, of the farm she had lost, of the single worn $10 bill that had represented the end of one life and the beginning of another. "I didn't save a machine, Commander," she said quietly, her voice carrying the simple weight of truth. "I just learned to listen to what everyone else had thrown away." This was her apotheosis, not in the praise of newspapers or the gratitude of the government, but in this quiet, certain knowledge. She had found her purpose not in owning something, but in stewarding it. She was no longer a girl defined by what she had lost. She was a woman defined by what she had found. The future was a vast, unknown territory, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like hers to explore. She was no longer homeless. She was home. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet courage to the very end. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden, not in what is shiny and new, but in what has been forgotten, waiting patiently for someone with the heart to see it. If you were moved by Alice Pemberton's remarkable journey, please show your support by giving this story a like and subscribing to our channel for more tales of lost history and the incredible people who bring it back to light. We'll see you next time.